Today's video is sponsored by NordVPN. Tragedy in video games can be a very bittersweet thing. On one hand, many people absorb themselves into fictional worlds with fictional stories as a means of escaping the mundane and often unfair thing we all know as life. We're able to do things that would otherwise be impossible, leaving your office job to run a ranch, setting off on an adventure to become the world's greatest Pokemon master, ridding the world of evil by stealing people's hearts, or becoming a lawyer and cross-examining a parrot. But just because we use video games to take our minds off of our daily struggles, it doesn't mean that all the stories told must follow a happily ever after route. At times, it's the ones with the most tragedy and heartbreak that we, the player, cling on to. It makes these fictional worlds feel a lot more realistic, whether it be the life lessons taught to us or relatable characters. Even if the hero ends up slaying the beast and saving the princess, the journey that led to this climactic moment was no doubt filled with struggles and suffering. That's why games such as Majora's Mask and Breath of the Wild stand out from the rest, as they are stories heavily focusing on the darker perspective of things. Today, I'll be talking about some of the more tragic characters of the franchise. These range from the lesser-known side characters to those heavily involved in the plot. Taking place in a post-apocalyptic world, Breath of the Wild is a game filled with characters who have suffered, all thanks to the Great Calamity, an event responsible for the kingdom's destruction, along with the deaths of the champions and Zelda's father. The princess herself is the very definition of a tragic character, as her inability to awaken her power led to Hyrule's downfall. However, another person that comes to mind is the Zora champion Mipha. Of all the deaths, hers is the most impactful given her past relationship with Link. The two met long before the hero acquired the Master Sword, whom Mipha described as curious and full of energy. Link would eventually become an accomplished knight and obtain the Master Sword, but while the two continue to be close, the Zora princess goes on to state that he no longer speaks and smiles less often. Her friendship later turns into a romantic love for the hero after he effortlessly defeats a Lionel atop Ploymus Mountain. While it's never made clear if these feelings were one-sided, Mipha would go on to make the Zora armor, with the intention of gifting it to the hero. It was tradition for the Zora princess to craft this armor for their future husband, meaning that Mipha had planned to confess and marry her childhood friend. Her final diary entry suggests that this armor was to be given to Link at the time of the Memory 10 cutscene. But since this detail is never mentioned in their interactions with one another, it's unclear whether the Zora princess went through with her plan. But this was the last time Mipha would ever write in her diary, as the Great Calamity happened shortly after, leading to her inevitable demise. Eventually, the Zora armor would be handed to the hero, who used it to reclaim Varuta and free the princess's spirit after being trapped for over a century. The fact that Mipha died before she was able to properly confess to the hero is tragic, and one can only wonder what may have happened if she had not lost her life on that fateful day. What makes Mipha's death worse is that, while most people don't have memories of the now-deceased champions, the longer lifespan of the Zora means that many in the present day continue to live with the pain of losing their princess. Mipha's death not only affected Link, but also her family and people. A character worthy of discussion for sure. But sometimes the most well-written characters are those that don't take up the spotlight. And of all the side characters introduced in Breath of the Wild, Dorian has arguably the saddest backstory of the bunch. Prior to the Sheikah offering his services to Impa and the village, Dorian was a member of the Yiga clan, a group whose allegiance lay with Calamity Ganon. Eventually, he fell in love with a Sheikah woman and had 2 daughters. This development led him to change his ways and cut ties with the group, and as a response, his wife was killed. In fear of also losing his children, Dorian acted as an informant in the village, relaying information to the Yiga involving Link. What makes the story even more tragic is that, despite Dorian never telling his eldest daughter about the truth of her mother's death, Coco can be found every morning crying in front of the Kakariko village's graveyard. When asked about her mother, she goes on to say that she's aware of her passing and denies crying as she needs to be strong for Kotla, who's too young to understand the reality of things. She's often seen participating in a one-sided game of hide-and-seek, believing that one day she'll eventually find and reunite with her late mother. But Coco continues to look out for her family, acting as a motherly figure towards Katla. In fact, some of the concept art in Breath of the Wild's Masterworks book shows the spirit of a female Sheikah. Given what we know in the game, it's likely that this was planned to be Dorian's wife, perhaps an NPC that could only be interacted with in a quest or at night. I'm not sure as to why this idea was scrapped later in development, but it makes Dorian's story all the more tragic. In one of my earliest videos, I go into detail about this topic, so I'll have a link to that in the description below. It's really saying something when even the side characters are written in a way that makes them interesting. Oh, right, I have another sponsor for today's video. But how the heck am I going to segue into that on a video all about tragedy? There are so many characters on this list that I can't wait to get to. Spirit Tracks, Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask. Should I do it now? No, that would break away from the immersion of the episode. That would be way too sudden of a change in the atmosphere. And what I'm saying right now is also most definitely not filler while I have an internal monologue of how to introduce today's sponsor, because obviously this video isn't sponsored by anyone whatsoever. Maybe I could crack a sort of joke? Nah, that wouldn't work. It would just ruin the mood for the rest of the video. Oh, wait, I know. But you know what one of the most tragic things is outside of Zelda games? Not taking advantage of NordVPN's awesome deals. Nailed it. By going to the link in the description, nordvpn.com/NintendoBC, you'll get a huge discount on a 2-year plan along with 1 additional month. Not only does NordVPN keep all of your private information secure while connected to one of the many servers, it can also bypass region-locked content. That means if there's a certain show you want to watch, but for some reason it's only available in specific parts of the world, simply switching your server over to a different one will allow you to access said show. And this applies to anything internet related. Each account can be used on up to 6 devices, and none of this information is collected nor shared. And for someone like me who uses the internet on a daily basis, whether it be for work or personal use, protecting my private information is extremely important. Just click the link below where you can sign up for a 2-year plan plus 1 additional month at a massive discount. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee, so now is the time to try it out. That's nordvpn.com/NINTENDOBC. Now, since we started off this video by talking about the characters of one of the more well-known Zelda titles, let's shift gears a bit and cover a more obscure one in the franchise. Some of the most unappreciated games of the Zelda series are those on Nintendo's most successful console, as ironic as that sounds. But you don't hear that many people talk about Phantom Hourglass or Spirit Tracks. And while they aren't nearly as illustrious or grand as the console games, both are special in their own rights. I'm in the process of making a video all about Malladus, but that's going to take some time to be finished, so in the meantime, let's talk about another character from Spirit Tracks, that being Byrne. Byrne is a very interesting case when it comes to whether he truly falls into the category of a tragic character. In fact, his whole backstory is rather generic. He's a person who wished to gain power, and when he couldn't find that as Angene's apprentice, he turned to more darker methods. For most of the game, Byrne acts as one of the antagonists, who works alongside Chancellor Cole in an attempt to resurrect the demon king Malladus, all for the power he so desperately wants. However, once this plan comes to fruition, the two betray Angene's former apprentice. For the rest of the game, Byrne assists the hero in tracking down the essential items to locate Malladus and Chancellor Cole, who manages to defeat them both and save the day. Now, if it was just that, then Byrne wouldn't really be a tragic character. More so a villain turned good after being betrayed, but even then he seems to be fueled by his hatred towards that betrayal, rather than the desire to do good. That's until the climax preceding the final battle, where Zelda struggles to reclaim her body before Malladus can repossess it. In a last-ditch attempt, Byrne repels Malladus with his powers, and as a result, is killed by the Demon King. This, in my personal opinion, is what makes him a tragic character. Not only did he redeem himself, but he also sacrificed himself in order to do it. Angene states that perhaps he'll return in another life, and ever since then I've been hoping that we'll see more of Byrne in future titles. And deaths such as this are quite rare in Zelda. Well, excluding being crushed to death by a moon, and the Great Calamity, and Koholint disappearing. Okay, well I suppose there are a lot of deaths in Zelda, but unless it's either a villain or an entire population, it doesn't have that feeling of one who truly makes a sacrifice for the greater good. In my opinion, events like the Great Calamity aren't as impactful as deaths of characters you get to know throughout a game's story. That's why I adore Majora's Mask, since you get to look at how each character lived their lives mere days before the world's end. Speaking of Majora's Mask, wow, talk about a great segue of topics, because that's the next game on this list. I'll be honest here, when it comes to tragic Zelda characters, I could make 2 entire videos just talking about this game. But for this video, I wanted to look at a variety of games, so perhaps you'll see a part 2 on this topic in the future. Because trust me, there's a lot. But for now, I want to focus on what I believe to be 2 of the most emotionally stimulating cases of tragedy. The Anju and Cafe quest has to be, hands down, one of the best side stories in the Zelda series, and one of the most complex. Over the course of 3 days, the player must do a series of quests to reunite both characters who promise to marry on the day of the Carnival of Time. By the time Link arrives in Termina, Cafe has been transformed into a child by the Skull Kid, his wedding ceremony mask later being stolen by the thief Sekon. After meeting up with Cafe, both tail the thief and take back the mask, allowing you to finish up the quest. If the player gives Anju Cafe's pendant prior to this, she'll choose to stay behind while others evacuate the town, remembering her promise with Cafe. The two finally reunite and exchange their masks, rewarding Link with the couple's mask before telling him to take refuge somewhere outside of Clocktown. Anju and Cafe have decided not to run, and instead will spend their final hours together. The tone is quickly shifted from a heartwarming cutscene to one filled with sorrow, as both them and the player know that this night will be their last. Even if you do choose to save the couple in this time loop, the fact that both choose to accept their fate and die together instead of taking refuge at the ranch is some of this game's best storytelling, because while it's a satisfying ending, it's by no means a happy one. And that's one of the reasons why stories like this stand out compared to the rest. The ones that remind you of the sacrifices made while trying to accomplish your goals. It's why I wish I could go back and play games such as Red Dead Redemption 2 or even Super Paper Mario. But there are many other great examples of tragic characters when it comes to Majora's Mask. Anju and Cafe's side quest may be the most memorable moment of the game, but another character worth discussing is the Deku Butler. And this is one story I've wanted to cover on this channel for the longest time. On the surface, there's nothing out of the ordinary regarding this individual. He's a servant of the Deku King and later challenges Link to a race in a maze-like dungeon sprawling with traps and numerous paths. If the player manages to keep up with the Deku Butler, he receives the Mask of Sense. But what's interesting about this exchange is what's said to Link. The butler reveals that he has a son and would often race with him. But this is all said in past tense. In fact, the Deku Butler is unaware of his son's whereabouts, expressing concern that he has never written back. But it's not that his son doesn't write back, it's because he can't. In fact, the Deku Butler's son is one of the first NPCs you ever see in the game. On the path of the portal leading to Termina is a lone dead tree with a contorted face. One that Tattle describes as dark and gloomy, as if it could start crying. It's clear that this tree is different compared to the others, given the extra details. It's no coincidence that prior to this encounter, the Skull Kid cursed Link, transforming him into a Deku Scrub. Whatever happened to this dead tree is, in some way, connected to the story. It's possible that the soul of this tree, who we can assume to have once been a Deku, was stripped from the body and used to later curse Link, leaving behind an empty shell of its former self. Whatever methods Majora used to take this soul differ from the times Link plays the Song of Healing to obtain the masks, and while the tree continues to be a reminder of what transpired there, it's safe to say that even this soul found peace with the Song of Healing. Given this knowledge, it's likely that this corpse was once the Deku Butler's son, one of the many victims preyed upon by Majora. This was all but confirmed in the credits sequence, where one shot is of the Deku Butler mourning before the lifeless tree. It's a shot that, with the proper context, gives us all the answers we need. Yet another reminder of why Majora's Mask is such a gem among the Zelda series. Another interesting detail is that, while we don't see the butler's son prior to his death, we're given a general idea of what he looks like. When Link plays the Elegy of Emptiness, an empty shell of whatever form Link is in appears as a statue of sorts. These all closely resemble the original bodies the souls belong to, and there's one for a Deku Scrub. I think what hurts most about this story is that, unlike many other side quests and characters, no matter how many times the player goes back in time, it's impossible to save this Deku Sprout from his inevitable death. It just goes to show that, in life, there are some things you could never change. So, we've talked about a parent who lost their child. Now it's time to look at the reverse, and to do so, we need to shift gears to Twilight Princess. Twilight Princess was a game that introduced many strange and bizarre characters, some taking the spotlight more than others. Among these characters is Rutella, Queen of the Zora. Following Zan's invasion of Hyrule, the Shadow Beasts attacked the tribe's settlement, and in response, the Queen sent her own son Rallis to the castle to warn Princess Zelda of what was happening at the domain. But during his journey, the young Zora was attacked by monsters and saved by Ilia. Prince Rallis soon fell ill due to being away from the water for so long, and would never be able to see his mother again since she had been killed by the invading Shadow Beasts in front of her own people. While the player does later save Rallis, who is then treated at Kakariko Village, he barely talks and is often found praying at his father's grave. It's hard enough to lose one parent, so the thought of losing his mother as well is heartbreaking. He's put in a position similar to Breath of the Wild's Riju, who became the chief of the Gerudo at a young age due to her mother's passing. But unlike the Deku Butler's story, there is a somewhat happy ending to all of this. Rallis soon comes to accept the fact that he'll be king of the Zora, and his confidence grows, eventually returning to Zora's domain to fulfill his fate. And in the credits, we see Rutella watching over her son. While the prince can't see his mother, the way he reacts suggests that he can feel her presence. Man, I really need to replay Twilight Princess one of these days. We'll end off today's video with one more tragic character from Ocarina of Time. This one's a classic, and I've actually discussed it before. After the hero recovers all 3 of the spiritual stones and heads to Hyrule Castle, he witnesses the princess fleeing from Ganondorf, who gives Link the Ocarina of Time. The player then travels to the Temple of Time, uses the Ocarina to open the Gate of Time, and retrieve the Master Sword. But since most players choose to go straight to the temple to continue on with the story, there's a detail that's easily missed. Going to the back alley reveals this wounded guard, who, when talked to, reveals that Ganondorf betrayed the king, once again telling Link to go to the Temple of Time. After he says this, the soldier spazzes out for a brief moment and stops moving. After this, it's impossible to talk to him, implying that he died shortly after this exchange with Link. It's possible that there was some sort of mutiny within the castle, given the previous shot of Ganondorf chasing the princess, and the fact that, despite all this happening, the residents of Castletown seem oblivious to what's really going on. It's also possible that this whole event was staged by Ganondorf, with this being one of the soldiers that betrayed the king, but I like to believe that this was a guard who died protecting the princess. On the bright side, this means that you technically save the soldier's life at the end of the game as the hero goes back in time to warn the king of Ganondorf's betrayal. Like I said before, if you're interested in learning more about this topic, I have a whole theory on the matter, so a link to that will also be in the description below. These are only some of the many tragic characters in the Zelda series. Games such as Majora's Mask are filled with great examples, and if people are interested, I wouldn't mind making this into a mini-series. Theories are great and all, but there's only so much you can theorize about before it turns into redundant topics or baseless speculation. As always, thanks for watching today's video, and if you haven't yet, a subscription to the channel would be appreciated. Things have been very slow recently, but I hope to change that in the upcoming months. I've been NintendoBlackCrisis, and I'll see you all next time.